over the last 72 hours has been absolutely heartbreaking, as we have seen in Afghanistan, as just a dramatic takeover by the Taliban. It's a group maybe that you haven't thought about in 10 years or so, because it was certainly front and center on the news back in 2001 after 9/11, and certainly in all the conversation that led up to the U.S. invading Afghanistan and trying to unseat the Taliban and particularly al-Qaeda. And it's just been a different place over particularly the last 5 or 10 years. And now it is back, and we have watched with absolute horror what is taking place as this nation is being flipped on its head. Now, the story is changing very quickly, and it's changing very quickly day by day, hour by hour. We are recording this interview on Monday morning, right around noon Eastern and 10 Mountain time. And I'm going to have a conversation with Mindy Belz, senior editor of World News Group. She has been, for a long time, my go-to source on issues of international policy, international incidents, and particularly the plight of Christians around the world when it comes to religious freedom in these very vulnerable places in the Middle East. She's a senior editor at World News Group and also a longtime friend. She's also authored a book called They Say We Are Infidels. You can find that at our bookstore, breakpoint.org, or you can find it on Amazon. So I'm going to welcome here and have a conversation about what's been happening in Afghanistan with Mindy Belz of World News Group. Mindy, I just can't say thanks enough, because I know, for you, this story is not only moving fast, it's not only kind of your beat for so long, but these are a lot of your friends in Afghanistan that are being affected by these dramatic changes. So thank you so much for having the conversation.
Sure. That's all true. And I appreciate you asking the questions.
Well, what's your take? I'm just going to let you talk for a bit, because it's moving so fast, and there's so many political fingers being pointed and blame. And there, of course, is the Christians on the ground who were decimated 20 years ago and recovered and now decimated, or are being threatened with decimation all over again.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's one of the things that I think Americans have a hard time appreciating is, I wouldn't just say decimated from 20 years ago. I would say that, we've heard only bad news from Afghanistan for most of these 20 years since the U.S. war began. And the problem is that we haven't seen the good side. And the last time I was in Afghanistan, I spent a lot of time at the University of Kabul, and I came away just energized by what I was seeing from this college generation there. The women were not wearing the full Taliban burqas. They were out in the streets in their scarves, talking to men, going to classes. I went to classes where they were sitting in a room with other men. This was revolutionary, and it was a new day. And, I attended, there was a guy, he's now an official in the Afghan government, who had the Yale debate team come over a few years ago, because he said we need to learn a better way to talk about our differences in Afghanistan. Those are the kinds of things that have been happening there. And so you have this whole generation that has not lived under Taliban rule, that in a lightning strike, and we can't emphasize how fast this has been. 3 days ago, 4 days ago, we did not think they would take Kabul. And it's a fait accompli. Kabul is taken. The Taliban is in control. And what happens to this generation that has grown up under sort of U.S. supervised freedoms, I think it's fair to call them that, as imperfect as our time in Afghanistan has been. What happens to this generation is completely the question of the moment, and really kind of a desperate question of the moment.
So tell us where the resurgence of the Taliban. I know these are details that many of us should know with the withdrawal of U.S. troops and so on, but tell us what led up to this. Just catch everybody up.
I think it's fair to say, whether it is a failure of intelligence or a failure of politics, that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration coming in have publicly underestimated the reach, the scope, the continued durability of the Taliban, and let's be clear, of al-Qaeda along with them. And And so you had a number of people, former military, experts who've been following counterterrorism this 2 decades, who have been saying all along, we're not done yet, and have been saying they're still there. And it was very clear in April when President Biden, gave a speech, made it very clear that we were going to pull out, that we would not make the May 1 deadline that was set in the agreement that Trump reached with the Taliban, but we would make a 9/11 agreement, which to everyone seemed like just like bad dark theater. Why would you pick the 20th anniversary of 9/11? And to this day, that is just a really great mystery. Right. But when he did that in such a forceful and determined way, immediately people were saying, the Taliban has a plan for this. They've been planning, they've had their people in key strategic areas for months and really even years. They've had years of being lurking in the shadows, being able to plan what they would do when this full withdrawal came. And I think for us, one of the things that's hard to understand, 2,500, 3,500 troops on the ground. But those troops on the ground also had support teams around them, private contractors, number of people who were defense, intelligence, and diplomatic, analysts, researchers, support within the embassy compound, within Camp Eggers, which is right near the embassy compound in downtown Kabul. That's all what we lost at that time. So that helps us understand, I think, why 2,500 troops were so important. We get fixated on that number. But around that number was a very strategic, important sort of stabilization force, I would say, that had not taken a casualty in 18 months. That's all of what we pulled out. And it basically was like pulling a thread, and it happened so rapidly. And the Taliban was ready to move in, and they were very strategic. They actually went after the areas in the north that were hardest for them to take first, and they took them because we had pulled out of them. Then they went to the west, and then they hit in the south at the same time. And so they basically, by mid-July, had 2/3 of the center of the country and the capital, Kabul, surrounded. And then it was just a matter of time. And we began to see the Afghan army disintegrate. And, on Sunday, the president, Ashraf Ghani, get in a plane and fly away. I feel a little bit like a cynic at this point, because this is like watching what happened in Iraq in 2014, that we were just astonished when the whole Iraq army melted away and allowed ISIS to take over a city of 2 million. And so here we are now. We have watched the Afghan army melt away and the Taliban move in and take over a city of nearly 6 million people. And I don't have words for it, but that's where we are.
Okay, so try to put some words to the American responsibility here. There was plenty said about how quick the Biden administration pulled out of Afghanistan. But of course, their line is that they were following an agreement that was put into place by President Trump.
It's very interesting to have Democrats standing on the fact that they inherited something. Inherited is the word that Biden used. And I think we want to underscore that the Biden administration is standing on the fact that it inherited something from President Trump. But yeah, I think there's
that's not an excuse that they would ever use on any other policy issue.
No.
Right? It's like, they did this, we're going to do this. Why did they feel bound to Trump's policy?
We're going to stay the Republican course. But I think what it should underscore, though, for us, because we really need a bipartisan movement to get through what I think is a huge crisis for the world and for our country on this. I think there is plenty of blame to go around. I just think that the history of the war in Afghanistan is a history of what someone last week called political ambivalence that really starts and stops with the President of the United States. We have not had a president since the initial decision to go in October of 2001. We have not had a president fully committed to prosecuting the objectives that president set out. So you had, let's move to 2010, 2014 era. You have President Obama announcing an end to combat operations, but then creating a surge and sending more troops in and creating this confusing atmosphere as to what our goals were at that point and not completing a withdrawal. And Biden was very much a part of that. One of the first things that Vice President Biden did, even before President Obama was inaugurated, is he was sent to Afghanistan to size up the situation. And he has leaned on that experience a number of times as informing his judgment. But I think that if you come forward, so then you have the Trump era where President Trump was determined to sort of see through what Obama had failed to see through. But what he did was he sat down with the Taliban, or his people sat down with the Taliban, in Qatar, which has been one of the sponsors of the Taliban, and never included the Afghan government. U.S. officials were sent over there in 2018 and met secretly with the Taliban. And so just the picture, it's not hard to understand for even the most non-expert of us what's wrong with this picture. The idea that we have, for all of these years, tried to build up the Afghan government, stand alongside them, fight alongside their military, and that then we would go to Qatar and secretly meet our top people, our top envoy, and meet with the Taliban, and then launch these negotiations that never included the Afghan government, was the beginning of the breakdown. The Trump administration pushed forward with that and signed an agreement with the Taliban that they said would lead toward peace negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Some of those meetings have taken place, but you have to understand that what we did is we put the Taliban in the driver's seat, and we never took them out of it. A top official in the government who I spoke to, and who's not named because his family is in harm's way, I can't name him, but he said to me last week, the problem for us has been that there's been too much pressure on the Afghan government and too much respect for the Taliban. That's how we've been approaching it from Trump to Biden, and that's how we have gotten to this place where we somehow got the idea that the Taliban was going to do what they said they were going to do. And all along, they have had the strategic plan for the military takeover of Afghanistan, which is what we've watched happen.
Over and over. I mean, I go back 20 years ago, and, as someone who pays attention to worldviews and the impact that worldview makes, we talked 20 years ago at 9/11 how we underestimated Islam and how we underestimated the deeply held convictions about life in the world and what it demanded in terms of action, and how it set their historical memory. One of the things that struck me, Mindy, in the last 24 hours listening to various accounts, the New York Times on the Daily podcast has a very intimate account of a source there in Afghanistan, a woman who has been involved in so many of the reforms and trying to push for women's rights and all that, and probably from a perspective, a feminist perspective that I wouldn't agree with, but to see all that collapse. And the two things that stood out was how quickly it's, she's like, it's just like a dream, because yesterday Afghanistan looked like this, and today it looks like this. But the other thing is that, there was parts of this interview, and I'll see if I can put this into words, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on it, where it's like from a Western journalistic perspective, it was like, oh, there was the Taliban, then there was Afghanistan, and now there's the Taliban again, and it's a tragedy. From the Taliban's perspective, this was all the same story. The last 20 years was an unfortunate setback. This was their country. The historical commitment, first of all, and then the unshakable, unwavering commitment to where history was headed, which is all worldview stuff, was never up in the air. And now they're just receiving what they had always believed would happen. Does that make any sense? Am I reading that wrong?
No, that's exactly right. I think it's not. I think it's not an understatement to say that we face an existential crisis. I know that term gets thrown around a lot. And it is a philosophical one at the root. I think it also gets to sort of the organization of our government and the disconnect we average Americans, we voters feel like we have all this information and we can plug in all these different ways to what's actually happening in the world. But there's a great disconnect between how our government is functioning and how it looks like it's functioning. So we see someone like Joe Biden making the decisions and the statements that he's making, or Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, but we've lost sight of the fact that there are hundreds of people feeding those decisions at the State Department and the National Security. When I learned that Obama had doubled the size of the National Security Council and it had like 800 employees, I was shocked. But so we have to understand that where these policy decisions are coming from and policy statements are coming from a bureaucracy that is bloated, that has a lot of competing philosophical and security interests within it. And then you add how our politicians have become more tied to paid lobbyists, more interested in sort of the paid interests rather than national and average American interests, that voters are just way outside this whole equation. And I believe this is how our messages and let's just say our war fighting has gotten really bogged down, and we simply are not able to prosecute war on the terms that it's being fed to us, that it's being prosecuted. So people think, why can't we win a war in Afghanistan in 20 years? Well, that's because day after day after day, we have a bloated bureaucracy that is refusing to prosecute it on the terms in which Americans have been sold on it. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Talk a little bit about, give. I don't want to. Gosh, I want to ask these questions well. Talk a little bit about what the withdrawal of U.S. troops just in the Biden decision. How should that have gone differently? I know it's an armchair quarterback question, but how bad? It looks really, really bad. Is it as bad as it looks?
It's the worst I can imagine. Going back and looking at Obama's withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, which was also bad, but it wasn't this bad. The disastrous pullout of Saigon, in 1975. I went back and looked at some press conferences that Henry Kissinger did. At least you can say that Henry Kissinger was owning the mistakes and owning the difficulty of it. And also that the United States was pulling tens of thousands of Vietnamese out with all of our people. Those are things that aren't happening right now. Instead, if you listen carefully to Biden, what you hear him saying is that the mission is getting narrowed. We aren't trying to protect Afghanistan from becoming a training ground for Al-Qaeda again now. We are simply trying to protect our people and get them home. And I think that speaks to just how badly it has gone. And it's sort of like, if you just reverse the steps, you would have maybe what the order should have been. In other words, if we had just a couple of things over the recent, if we had in July, we shut down Bagram Air Base, which directly adjoins. I've gotten on planes at the Kabul International Airport and looked across the way at the C-17s at Bagram. If we had left that airport open in order to facilitate this evacuation, you would not see the chaos at the Kabul airport right now that you have.
Oh, these images from today are just incredible. Afghans climbing on planes as they're taking off.
Because I was talking to a member of parliament on the plane last night to Istanbul, and this is a very brave woman who was very, very afraid and not even comfortable talking because of how chaotic the situation on that plane was. They had a 777 that could hold about 300 people, and they had 800 people trying to get on this plane. But here's what we did in the midst of that. Because we had shut down Bagram Air Base, we are bringing our Marines in and demanding that we be allowed to get our people out. The United States took over air traffic control at Kabul International Airport overnight last night. And we shut down commercial flights going out. These are Afghans who have paid money to get themselves and their families out of harm's way. And they weren't able to get out. That's why you saw the desperation. And I think we're going to continue to see it. We might only be seeing the beginning of it because it's unclear how long the United States is going to insist on taking control of this airport. So there, to go back and really answer your question, because I think there are a couple of really good pinpoint items. Congress stood up an Afghanistan study group, a high-level group, members of Congress who have served in Afghanistan alongside former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Robert Dunford, and other top commanders. They studied the situation as it is, the agreements as they are, and they came away, and their conclusion in short was, there's an opportunity for peace in Afghanistan. It's an opportunity that has to involve all the players. It can't be this U.S. Taliban conversation. It has to include Afghanistan. It has to include the government. It has to include neighbors who are also going to bear the brunt of this. And then they said, and it also has to not be tied to an inflexible withdrawal timeline. And those are the places, because what happened was, and President Obama did the same thing, and I don't know, maybe President Trump would have done the same thing, but President Biden first said when we would be out, and then asked the military and the Afghans and everyone else to figure out how to make that happen. Instead of first putting conditions on the Taliban, on the Afghan government, that would make it possible for this withdrawal and this evacuation to happen. It's almost so bad that you think there's something behind this going on, because you just can't explain how bad it is otherwise.
It just seems so bizarre. It's so bad it can't be incompetent. It's so bad. It's got to be. There's got to be some sort of thing. Is this the defining moment of Biden's presidency?
I'm afraid it will be. I really am, because I feel like we have, we've got major issues facing our country, and I don't have to tell you what those are. And
Sure.
And so to have something that didn't have to go this way become such a vast global disaster, sure, maybe by next week we'll be focused on something else, and we'll be letting Afghanistan figure out its own horror. But I have a feeling that it's not going to go away. I really do have a feeling that we're at the beginning of something. We're not at the end of it.
Right. Well, so three quick things. First, I want you to respond. There's two excuses that the Biden administration is given for doing this. Number one is that they were locked in by Trump. They inherited this. Did they have to do this because Trump promised it?
No, and I would use as evidence the fact that Biden did extend the deadline. In other words, Trump had agreed with the Taliban to a May 1 deadline. And the first thing Biden did was say, no, we can't do it by May 1, but we can do it by 9/11. So that, to me, right away,
he could have changed the thing.
Undermines his argument that he had no flexibility.
Yeah, and he didn't have to do it this way, right? He didn't have to do it like, wake up one morning and that Air Force base is completely abandoned.
Right.
And,
Right.
Okay, so second thing that we're hearing is that, particularly this morning from White House spokespersons, is that there was an expectation that the Afghan government and the Afghan army would stand up, and that they have not. Was that a reasonable expectation? Or should we have realized the kind of the vulnerable place that the army and the Afghan government was in?
I think we should have realized the vulnerable place. And, a lot of people understandably have jumped on the Afghan army and said, why could they not defend their country? They've had 20 years to figure out how to do it without us. I think that is I think that's only a half truth. If you take a force that for these 20 years has been reliant on U.S. Air Forces and air supremacy, no one can touch our air supremacy when we come into a place. And also no one can touch our technology. And so they have, if you just think about those two things, the air cover that we provided and the surveillance capabilities that we provided, and those were, again, going back to some of the mistakes, some of the first things we took away. And we basically asked a crippled Afghan National Security Force to do a job they had not yet been called to do, to defend their whole country all alone. We asked them to defend the whole country. And then along with that, underestimating the reach, scope, and force that the Taliban would bring.
I want to go back then 20 years ago. The 9/11 anniversary and timeline is creepy. I mean, there's just something dramatically discomforting about the whole thing. But we go back to 9/11 and we realize that it was 8 years between the first World Trade Center attempted bombing and what happened on 9/11. And you realize that there were places around the world that for 8 years gave cover to individuals so that this sort of planning, this sort of patient strategizing could happen. You look at that sort of strategizing took place from the Taliban, and as you said, Al-Qaeda. I want you to address that here in just a second. I know we're going longer than you promised, but I'm so grateful for all of this information. But that, 20 years of planning. So we know that there's the patience. So when you said this is not the end, this is the beginning, Afghanistan was a haven for terrorists around the world. Some of the worst, some of the ones that were so well coordinated that they were able to carry out incredible, acts of terrorism in Western nations. Have we just basically given them a home base again?
Well, there's a lot of good reason to think that. I mean, we do want to be careful about living in the hypotheticals, and I think we can,
right.
We can overthink and over worry and we've done that in the past where we've misjudged how weak the Soviet Union had become. We've misjudged maybe how weak at various points over the last 20 years Al-Qaeda has become. But what we have steadily underestimated is what it would take to break them. And you can just look at some key points throughout these last 20 years. I mean, they do have a cultural patience on their side, and they recognize this. They understand the West, that we are an impatient people and that we want things done, over, onto the next thing. And they are a very patient people. They have a 1,000-year history that they love and cherish, and they are willing to wait. And that has consistently been a strategic error that we've made. And then we just, you go back to when we had the intelligence, we had the military in place. We knew that Osama bin Laden was in Tora Bora. This was back in maybe 2004, I believe. And Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was the person who made the call. The military was saying, we need twice as many people as we have for this operation. And he said, no, you can do it. And they couldn't do it. And bin Laden got away, and he lived another day, and some more things happened. But I don't think it's all been for naught. I think it's reasonable to point out, if you say, well, so what has the last 20 years in Afghanistan bought us? Well, it has bought us not another World Trade Center type attack. It really has bought us that. That was intended to be the first. And we haven't had the second one. We've had other lesser ones. I don't want to diminish them. And we've had a slew of things in the region and a slew of just hardship and unspeakable devastation for Iraqis and Afghans and others. But we haven't had the attacks that we could have had, perhaps. So I just think it's going to take some kind of new leadership or some kind of moment where the United States begins to really look at these terror groups for what they are, in order for us to, in some way, combat and break them, as opposed to continuing this kind of unsuccessful fight. I think it's possible because you look at, we're not talking about the Nazi threat. We're not talking about the Soviet threat today. So that all tells us that enemies that seem like they can't be vanquished actually can be vanquished.
Yeah. Well, and I want to be clear, too, that this isn't bad because of the potential consequence for the United States, in another 10 years. It's bad because it's bad policy, and it's leaving, an entire nation and all of its citizens in such an incredibly vulnerable place. And the difference between an Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban and an Afghanistan not ruled by the Taliban is night and day. I mean, it is the difference of human rights, particularly of women, and it's just an awful place. And I think we forget about that. You posted, and by the way, I want to give a quick plug. I always say if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at such and such, and if you're not on Twitter, don't start. But your Twitter feed on this has been really helpful for me at MC Belz, BELZ, at MC Belz, and I want to point everybody there as well as to your email, and I'll let you talk about that in just a second. But you
Can I just
posted
say,
there.
John, that I changed my Twitter handle to Mindy Belz, so it's easier.
Oh, that's right. I did notice that today. Forgive me. Yes, at Mindy, MINDYBELZ. That's right. So yes, but you tweeted particularly about some threats that are happening to Christians on the ground. Could you describe that quickly?
Yeah, quickly, that it's a unique community that is mostly young people, and by young people I mean 40 and under, and that is all Muslim converts. And the people who study people groups and Christian movements say that it's one of the fastest growing churches in the world. And if you are a tiny, tiny church and you double in size, you can be the fastest growing in the world. So it is still very small. I keep asking people, how big are we talking about? And they just won't say. But it's small. It's a couple thousand people, maybe. But they are an important force in Afghanistan simply because of the force that the gospel has. And they also, because I've seen the reach that they have, I mean, the love of Jesus is a real thing, and it's a real thing in a dark place like a Taliban shadowed country. And so I've seen the effect that many of these young believers have had in their university settings, now in the government. Some of them are in the government. And in their neighborhoods and in their businesses. And so we can't underestimate the power of this large community. It's an interesting story that I'll try to be brief in explaining. A number of the leaders in this community did a really amazing and brave thing starting about 2 years ago. And that is that they decided they wanted to change their identity, their religious affiliation on their national ID cards. We don't appreciate this, but this part of the world, everyone has a national ID card. They're used all the time for all kinds of things, and they always have religious affiliation. And that affiliation tends to be handed down. So the affiliation on your card is probably whatever your father's was. And these elders in these churches wanted to change their identification for the sake of future generations. And not everyone was in agreement that this was a good idea, but several dozen of them pushed through and have actually changed their identification. So they, in the government records where they are registered with the Afghan government, it says that they are Christians. And it's interesting that those are the ones who over the past few days have been targeted. What
do you mean targeted?
Well, I know of at least one letter that one of them received from the Taliban saying, we know where you are and we know what you're doing. And that implies immediately that they've somehow had access to this government record. And that family, because these people are very versed with the world that they're living in, that family left their home after receiving this message and don't know where they are. Even the people who are very close to them don't know where they are at this point. And Taliban, sure enough, showed up on Saturday before the full takeover of the city to visit their house. People were watching because they want to know what the Taliban is up to. And they saw this happen. And the Taliban also have visited other Christian homes. And so these are, you might argue small, isolated things, but they play against this backdrop of atrocities that we're hearing about of Afghan military who have been hauled out of their homes and shot, or in one case beheaded, and that was a report that was given to the embassy. The embassy issued that report, the U.S. embassy. So there's These are not fabricated things that are happening. And these are the kinds of things that the Taliban is known for. Everyone has to submit. Everyone has to follow this extreme radical Islamic code. We've heard already of schools being closed and things like that. So I think the Christians, they're completely vulnerable. They have no political power. They have no one to appeal to. One of them said to me, they don't even generally qualify for special immigrant visas to the United States or other Western countries because they simply have stayed away from working for American organizations, working for the military in Afghanistan, because even that is something that would potentially expose them to attention and to danger.
And it's not clear that that would help because, I mean, how many people qualify for that and how many people are getting out? So, what you're saying, and this is one thought that I had given, the Trump administration, directly negotiating with the Taliban. Are we talking about a different Taliban, a more modern, a moderate Taliban? And the stories that you're telling us seem to suggest that that would be a wish, on a star.
Right. We're going to have to watch what the Taliban does and not what the Taliban says. That's just going to have to be our rule. Yeah.
I mean, they promised they were going to go into Kabul and they weren't going to target citizens and all of that. And yeah, it's hard to believe that. But we know, we just know that any sort of advance, women, girls being able to go to school, education, having a place in society. I mean, that's not going to be a negotiable for the Taliban. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. One other piece that's really important on all of this is what we've heard, and again, just surveying a few American NGOs that have been working in Afghanistan. Anybody who's there in 2021 is incredibly brave and durable because those groups have been targeted. If you remember in 2012, 2014, there was an incredible attack on a medical mission where 10 aid workers were killed. There have been American doctors who've been shot in their hospitals, things like that. So anybody who's still there is a really resilient group. And surveying a few of them just today, they all are saying the same thing. All the cars and other equipment property that belong to those NGOs has been taken. It's been taken by the Taliban. Many of them have been for days now trying to get their people to safety and get the people who can get out. That is not still happening. And I think this is a really important thing for us to say on Monday. Hopefully this story might be different in a couple of days. Americans are not out of Afghanistan. And definitely people who have worked with Americans are not out. There are still a number who are, I would say, in trapped situations. And meanwhile, the Taliban is moving in and seizing property in ways that are going to limit their ability to get out.
So I know you've been super generous with your time, Mindy. I know you're being sought after for comments and interviews and articles, especially in your role as senior editor at World News Group. So thank you for being so kind and generous. I know our folks are going to be asking, so this seems like there's nothing we can do. And I just want to remind everyone, people often ask, what can I do other than pray? It's like, well, praying is pretty important. I mean, praying is doing something, particularly when we're talking about our brothers and sisters, children of God, and we need to remember them in prayer. And I think we need to demand better from our government. This is a historical debacle at an incredible level, tragically, and lives are at stake. A nation is at stake, a nation of lives. So thanks for keeping us posted on this. Thanks for bringing the clarity and the understanding, framing this for us. Just really grateful for you, Mindy. Again, you can find Mindy on Twitter at Mindy Belz, MindyBelz. And then talk about your newsletter. This is such an important thing. It's a great source of information on these issues.
Yeah, thank you. Globetrot took a little summer hiatus. What a bad idea that was. But it's a weekly newsletter that I do. that is about current events around the world. I do it partly selfishly, so for myself as a discipline, and to keep me on track. But then I also do it because I just feel like generally, we in America, we have a pretty nice lot, and we tend to lose track of the needs and the issues that are around us in the world, and especially of those in the church around the world. So I try to focus on that. Comes out once a week.
Well,
possible to sign up for it, and hopefully it'll be back around Labor Day, if not sooner, as issues demand.
Well, we're all going to make you do it if you don't. It's too important. So, go sign up and please give us that resource again. Mindy, really grateful for you. Thank you for your leadership, your long work in this area. Again, her book is also called They Call Us Infidels, and you can find that on Amazon. We'll link to it at breakpoint.org. Mindy, I'm so grateful for you. Thanks for this help.
Same to you, John. Thank you for having me.